As Bob has mentioned, our speaker today is Becky Robison. She's a writer living in Louisville, Kentucky, and a graduate of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Creative Writing MFA program, and her work has appeared in Salon, Slate, Business Insider, and elsewhere. She's also the mind behind deadparentswhatnow.com, a project that aims to help people navigate the dizzying labyrinth of post-death bureaucracy based on her own experience. In her book, Becky writes that her mother and father died when she and her sister were in their 30s. Becky soon realized she was completely unprepared for legal and financial ramifications of their death. And after 3 stress-filled years, and she put together a kind of guide. Your parents are dead, now what? With everything she learned during her depressing paperwork nightmare. And then she asked in a joke-like tweet if anyone would be interested in this kind of resource. And she soon learned an overwhelming number of people wanted the content. The guide soon became her book, My Parents Are Dead, What Now? A panic-free guide to the practicalities of death, which is available now on Amazon and elsewhere. Becky is also helping people with post-death logistics and helping companies serve those peoples. This is her current full-time gig. So thank you very much, Becky, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you all see my slides? Is that something you can see? Wonderful. Well, like I said, thank you so much to Sherry for the incredible introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Bob and the whole board for inviting me here, and congratulations on your new term. I'm excited for you all and I'm excited for you to continue this good work. And thank you to Justin for all of the technical support and getting in touch with me and bringing all this together. I really appreciate you all for inviting me here to speak today. As you all know, the Funeral Consumers Alliance does incredible work teaching people how to make funerals more affordable. What I would like to talk to you about today is how to make everything after the funeral more affordable, because a lot comes after the funeral. It's a lot of work, and it is not always cheap. The Funeral Consumers Alliance has supported my work from the very beginning when it was just Dead Parents What Now, when I put the website out there. They've been supportive right from the start, and it has meant a lot to me. So again, for that reason too, I'm very glad to speak to you today. But who am I and what is that work? You'll find out in just a minute, but first I want to go over what we're talking about today. So let's go over the agenda. First, I'll introduce myself a little bit. I mean, Sherry did a great job of that, so it shouldn't take too long, but I'll just tell you a little bit more about me and my work. For the second part, I like to sort of do a thesis statement in my presentation. So if you take one thing away from this talk, this is what I want you to remember. Next, we'll talk about some of the things that you have to find a way to pay for. So the first one is paying for probate. That's the process of actually getting a will through the courts and making sure all those the tenets of the will are carried out appropriately, assuming there is a will. We'll talk about that a little bit too. You have to pay any bills that are remaining, any debts that are remaining that the estate needs to pay. If there's any property left over, you have to figure out what to do with that property. For millennials, like me at least, real estate is not something we are used to necessarily for people like me and younger. So that is an interesting challenge that you or people you love might face. And then, of course, the question of money itself. What if there's not enough money in the estate and you are trying to raise money in order to pay for the things you need to pay for? How can you make that happen? And how can you manage that money without spending money to make money, I guess? And then at the end, we will do questions. If you have questions throughout this, please put them in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Although please keep in mind that I am living here in Kentucky. I am not an expert in estate law in every single state, so or county. You know, it changes from state to state, from county to county. So I may not be able to answer very specific questions about your area, but I can try to do my best to answer more generally. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about who I am, and more importantly, perhaps who I am not. I am, like Sherry said, an orphan. My mom died in 2020. My dad died in 2023, which was not that long after I moved to Louisville. So I was living in a completely different estate, and I just had no idea what to do. But I did know what I was capable of doing. I knew I was a writer. I got my degree in creative writing. I, at the time, was working in corporate communications, and I am an eldest daughter. And of course, that means I see it as my duty to fix everyone else's problems. So I decided to create a website, deadparentswhatnow.com, which was supposed to be a side project, and B, a living document. It was supposed to be something where, as I was going through this work, figuring things out the hard way, I would put the information on that website, and then people could learn from the benefit of my experience. It was not supposed to be a full-time job. It was not supposed to be anything like that. And then someone shared it in a newsletter, and it got 20,000 views in the first week. And I said, uh-oh, I now have a whole extra kerfuffle on my hands here. So while I was doing my full-time job, I was managing this website and also trying to settle my parents' estate, which was a lot of work in and of itself. Then editors came calling. So, like Sherry said, I now have a book. My parents are dead. What now? A panic-free guide to the practicalities of death. This is what it looks like. You can get it anywhere books are sold. The worst part about having a book is selling the book. It's very awkward, but please buy my book or get it from your local library. It would mean a lot to me. While I was writing that book, I did a lot of research and I did a lot of training. So I actually trained as a death doula through the Death Wives out of Colorado. I also, it doesn't say this on the slide, but I actually audited an estate law course. I contacted a local law professor here in Louisville and said, is it okay if I jump in on your classes for a semester for free? Hey, maybe don't charge me. And he totally let me do it. So I zoomed into their classes for a semester and I read that 1,000-page textbook, which was more interesting actually than I expected it to be. So I did a ton of research. I know a little bit about estate law. I managed to interview a lot of experts when I was writing my book. But it is important to know that I am not an accountant and I am not an estate attorney. I cannot give you formal financial or legal advice in this presentation. That is not what I can do. Think of me as your morbid friend who's giving you some helpful pointers about how to do this stuff. I unfortunately cannot give you legal or financial full expertise. That's not who I am. But I am happy to help you out in any way I can with some basic pointers. So, the biggest thing I want you to know, if you take away anything from this presentation, what I want you to know is, drum roll, please, you do not inherit the debts of the dead, with a few caveats. You may have known this already, but you might be surprised how many people I talk to who absolutely have no idea about this. And so if you're one of those people, you can now breathe a sigh of relief that you do not inherit their debt. Quite frankly, I was one of those people. I didn't realize at first, after my parents died, that I wouldn't personally be on the hook for their debts because no one talks about this stuff. So I just didn't know. Like I said, there are a few caveats here where you may, in fact, be on the hook for some of that debt. So, for example, if you co-signed on a loan with this person, you might be responsible for the debt even after their death. If you are married and you have joint accounts or property and your spouse dies, you might be on the hook for some of that debt. But for the most part, if someone dies, you are not personally responsible for paying off their debt. Who is responsible? The estate. So the estate is all of the money and property and other assets that a person has left after they die. The debts do need to be paid out of that estate money, but it is not coming from your own personal money, except in these cases, like I've gone over here. So that is a great thing to tell your friends. It is a great thing to tell your kids. They will be relieved. I was certainly relieved when I found out. But even if you're not directly inheriting debt, post-death logistics can still be very expensive, from court fees to getting a house ready for sale. All of this takes work and it takes money. So let's talk a little bit about how to address these costs. First, we'll talk about paying for probate. So first of all, what is probate? Probate is the legal process that we have for carrying out someone's last wishes, and also so that the government can keep track of chain of title, who owns what property when, right? So if there is a will after someone dies, whoever is named in that will as executor will have to take that will to their local probate court, or rather the local probate court where that person died. And by working with the court, they will carry out the terms of that will and make sure whatever money is designated to which beneficiaries, those beneficiaries get that money or property, etc. Everything that's in the will be carried out, debts will be paid from the estate money, and then that estate will be closed. So like I said, oh, and I should also say, if there is no will, you don't get to magically escape probate court. If there is a will, someone would still have to go to the court and file to be the personal administrator of that estate and go through a similar process, except the state's intestacy laws will determine who gets what in that case. And intestacy laws, again, vary by state, county by county. They're a little bit different everywhere. But in that case, the state itself, the government would be deciding who is entitled to what property or money in that estate. The money for paying off these debts, paying off the dead person's debts, comes from the estate itself. But what if the estate has very little or nothing in it? That's something that happens sometimes, especially in this day and age where the cost of living is rising and debts are increasing. There are a few things you can do. The two I want to talk about mainly are summary administration and small estate affidavit. So if the amount of money and property and assets in an estate is small enough, you can do one of these two systems. Most states have these available for you to either minimize probate or skip it entirely if there's just simply not enough money in the estate to make it worth the state's while. So let me quote from my book really quick. Summary administration is a streamlined version of probate for estates with or without a will, as long as the estate's value doesn't exceed a certain amount. And small estate affidavits allow families to skip probate entirely if the estate is small enough. Typically, these are used when there is no will, but some states allow them when there is a will. So like I said, the estate has to be worth a certain amount or below in order to make these options possible. In New Jersey, that limit is $20,000. So if the estate is worth $20,000 or less, you may be able to file for a small estate affidavit after someone dies. Basically, you have to fill out a bunch of information about the deceased. You have to list what the assets are in the estate and how much they're worth. And if the court approves it, then you get to basically skip probate court. However, filling out these forms can still be a little bit complicated. It's not like they're written in friendly, normal human language. It can be a little bit intimidating. It can be a little bit confusing. So you may still want to hire legal help. Now, normally, hiring an estate attorney, again, that money comes from the estate. Something else that I didn't know when I was initially dealing with stuff and I was afraid I was going to have to pay for a lawyer, which was scary because I had barely even never talked to a lawyer, and suddenly I had to hire one. But if you feel that the estate can't afford an attorney, and if you're concerned that you also personally can't afford an attorney, you can look for help in terms of legal aid. So there are often legal aid organizations, nonprofits that do help provide legal services to people who can't afford them otherwise. I looked it up. In New Jersey, there's an organization called Legal Services of New Jersey. They may be able to help you. It's also worth looking at local law colleges in your area. Oftentimes, they will put together various law clinics where students at the law school can get experience doing various things under the supervision of their professors who are licensed lawyers, who have passed the bar and everything. So they may have legal clinic services available for you at those law colleges to help you out in that way. So that's what I would suggest in terms of looking for legal help. Now, you may ask, can I avoid probate altogether without doing any of these things? Not once you're already dead. You can't avoid it. Now, you can plan ahead to avoid probate court with something that the fancy lawyers call a non-probate transfer. I'm not going to go through an exhausted list of non-probate transfers, but there are some common ones. One is a living trust, typically a revocable living trust. Think of a trust like an invisible box. You put all your stuff inside the invisible box. You no longer own your stuff. The box does, but you are the trustee of the box. So basically, you still kind of get to control everything. You also name a successor trusts over the invisible box, but the invisible box has not died. It can't die. So it doesn't have to go through probate court. That is one way to skip probate court if you set up a trust in advance. It's very important to make sure everything you want in the trust is actually listed. List out what is in the trust, because if you forget to put some stuff in there, then that stuff will have to go through probate court, which is what happened to me. My parents had a trust, but they forgot to put a few assets in there, so I had to go to probate court to get those assets put into the trust. You don't have to have like a gazillion dollars to have a trust. I think we hear the phrase trust fund baby and think it's only for rich people. That's not true. You can put just a little bit of money or whatever into a trust. The problem is that you have to pay the lawyer's fees to create a trust. That's what costs money about making a trust mainly, is getting the lawyer's fees to help you create that trust and transfer all the money into the trust. So it's something you can consider if you have enough money to do that before you die. A trust cannot be created like post-death. So you were going to want to do that before you die if you want to get that set up. There are also some websites like Trust and Will, where you can, for a certain fee, they'll help you kind of create like a boilerplate trust. But I don't believe it's available in every state. And you'd still have to print it out afterwards and get it notarized, witnessed, all that stuff to make it fully legal. Some other non-probate transfers, life insurance, that money doesn't have to go through probate court. So if you have a life insurance policy and you name a beneficiary, they get the money directly. And then I know the Funeral Consumers Alliance talks about this a lot, but there are also payable on death bank accounts. So you create a bank account. You work with your bank to create something that's specifically labeled payable on death. You name a beneficiary, and again, that beneficiary can get the money directly when you die. It doesn't have to go through probate court. So those are a few ways that you can avoid probate court. But again, all of those have to be set up before you die. They can't happen after you die. If the death has already occurred and you're dealing with cleaning up the mess that remains afterwards, you're going to want to look into summary administration or a small estate affidavit, assuming the estate is small enough. However, once you're in probate, once you start that process off, you still have to pay the bills, which is expensive. How are you going to do that? So let's talk about it. When you begin the probate process, it's worth noting that creditors get first dibs on everything, not the heirs or not the beneficiaries. So if you're like, I am wonderfully leaving my money to my children or what have you, if you have debts, those creditors get first dibs on that money, not your kids. So you may think to yourself, why should you even start the probate process sooner? Why would you want to give these creditors a heads up to take your money and your property, right? Because it starts a timer. When you begin the probate process, creditors only have a limited time to make claims on your estate. And if they pass that time limit, they don't get to make claims anymore. So again, I looked this up. In New Jersey, creditors only have 9 months to make claims on your estate. So once you begin the probate process, they have 9 months to try to get your money. And after that, they cannot try to get your money anymore. So that's why it's a good idea to kind of start that process. It's also worth noting that creditors don't want you to know that you don't inherit the debts of the dead. Remember in the beginning, I talked about you don't inherit your dead people's debt. Creditors, they don't want you to know that at all. They want the money even if you're personally paying it. So don't let them tell you otherwise. You are not on the hook for these debts. The estate is on the hook for the debts. If the estate doesn't have enough money to pay those creditors are out of luck. There is simply nothing they can do. So don't make these creditors feel like you are personally responsible for this debt. You are not. You should negotiate everything if you can, even whether the estate has money in it or not. It's worth your time to actually negotiate with these creditors to make sure you're not paying more than you should. And so I'm going to talk about 3 of the most common kinds of debt in the United States and how you can go through and sort of negotiate this stuff. So first of all, credit cards. Was this person collecting credit card points on their credit card? Sometimes those points can be used to pay off some of the debt. Look at one of their credit card bills, whether that's online or in the mail. See if they were paying for credit card protection and insurance. If they were paying for that insurance, often that insurance will cover the debt on the card after they die. Not everybody pays for this. I don't pay for this on my card, but some people do. So it's worth looking on the card to see if they're paying for insurance. And then this negotiation tactic can often work well with many types of creditors, not just credit card companies, but offer to pay a certain amount of money or a smaller amount of money now rather than all of it later or never, right? Because the company wants some of that money. It's a lot of work for them to get in touch with bill collectors and start that process of like chasing you down for the debt, right? So they don't want to do that. So if you offer to pay some money now, like a certain amount, like I'll pay half of it now and you'll get half of it, but that's, I think, all we can afford. They're probably more likely to take that than no payment at all. Sort of an example of this is when, after my dad died, I was working with his credit card company and he had some recurring charges for like streaming services and stuff. So I said to them, I don't think we should have to pay any of the recurring charges after he died for like streaming services that he was not using because he was dead. And they were able to take those off the bill. So they agreed to take those off the bill. So it's worth talking to these people. They're not completely unreasonable. It's a lot of time and effort, but always make sure you're negotiating with them. Medical bills. Obviously, you're paying for medical bills before a death occurs if an illness is involved. But often after the death occurs, you will get kind of those final bills for anything that hasn't already been paid, right? The first thing you want to do, and this is something you should do anytime you're negotiating medical debt, whether or not a death has occurred. Like if you are having a health crisis and you go, to the hospital and they send you a bill afterwards and it's huge, ask them for an itemized bill so that they have to list each and every one of the individual charges. You will often find that something has happened where they have charged like $500 for a bandage. And then you can call them up and say, hey, I don't think I should have to pay $500 for a bandage. So, but if you have that itemized bill, you can dispute those individual charges with them. So you need to ask them for an itemized version rather than just having one lump sum of a bill. Many hospitals and other medical facilities do offer some forms of financial assistance. For instance, they can offer payment plans usually, so you're only paying the debt off, in smaller amounts rather than all at once, or sometimes they can negotiate down. So you can either call them and ask for like a financial assistance department, or if the hospital or medical facility has patient advocates or a patient advocacy department, they can usually help you out with that. So it's something worth looking into. And then there are also charities that do help pay off medical debt. So if you or a friend can help research those, sometimes those charitable organizations can hook you up with some help. And then finally, student loans. This is something many, many people in the United States have to pay off in order to go to college. If this deceased person had federal student loans, those loans are just discharged at death. They don't have to pay anything after a death has occurred. If there are private loans, then you're going to have to negotiate with the lender. So some of these other tips I talked about would apply here too. But if they're private loans, you will have to negotiate them. If they are federal loans, then those should be discharged at death for student loans. So we've talked about paying off the bills. How do you deal with property after someone has died and either deciding what to do with that property or paying for it or selling it or what have you? Again, the best time to get rid of large ticket items in terms of your property is before you die. Let's say you're getting older, it's hard to get around a big house with many stairs. Maybe you want to sell it to your kids or somebody else or whoever before you die and then move in, somewhere else into a mother-in-law suite or into a facility or whatever. Consider getting rid. I know it's like tempting to hold on to our beautiful stuff that we love and, for the rest of our lives, but it's easier to get rid of the stuff before you die than it is to get rid of it afterwards. Similarly, with your fancy car that you love driving it around, how often do you drive it around now? Maybe you want to get rid of it before you die. Just a lot easier to do this before death. If you're selling it to someone like a family member or a neighbor, you can use a quitclaim deed. It's a little bit faster and less of a complicated process than selling it in a traditional way where it's just kind of like you name a beneficiary and everybody signs and then it's theirs. Again, you should probably only do that if you trust the person implicitly, but that's an option. So if the death has not yet occurred, getting rid of the stuff before the death is the best way to go about things. But after a death has occurred, let's say there's not a lot of money in the estate, and sometimes you still have to make payments on this property. And what if the estate doesn't have enough money in it to make those payments? What do you do? So one thing that could happen, I should say, is repossessions. Usually this is going to happen with something like a car. The person who died had a car. They're making payments on this car. Maybe they were already missing payments. Who knows? Can the estate pay for the car? We don't know. There are two types of repossessions, voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary is they will contact you that the car is going to be repossessed and you say, yeah, I see that it does need to happen. I will voluntarily turn this car over to you or whatever it is. Involuntary is they just come and take it. Guess what's better? Voluntary. It's easier for everyone involved. If the estate genuinely cannot pay for this, maybe consider a voluntary repossession. Similarly, the estate might be making mortgage payments on a home. After my parents died, they were snowbirding. They had a little condo, I should say, in Wisconsin. They had a little condo in Florida. The condo in Wisconsin was fully paid off, but the one in Florida was not fully paid off. So until I sold it, the estate was making mortgage payments on that condo. But what if the estate can't make those payments? Or perhaps, again, the deceased person was not making those payments before they died. the house might get foreclosed upon. So this is a slow process. First, the lender has to file a lawsuit. They'll get a bunch of notices. It usually takes something like a year for the whole foreclosure process to occur. And then eventually the bank repossesses the property and auctions it off. There are some ways to help prevent or put off foreclosures. One thing is looking to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The US HUD has free counseling services. So if you just Google US Housing and Urban Development counseling, you can go on their website and set up and contact a counselor so they can help you work through some of this stuff, usually for free. It's also worth noting that the Trump administration has been making cuts to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but at least the last time I checked, those counseling services were to at least a certain extent still available. So it's definitely something worth looking into. There's also something called a short sale. So this is when you sell the house for less than it would cost to pay back the mortgage with the lender's permission. You're coming up short on the money, but the lender is willing to take less money than what they're owed in order to avoid foreclosure, because foreclosure is a pain for them too. So you could do a short sale. There are often some real estate agents who actually specialize in short sales. So that's something you can do if you need help with this process. So those are things you can do if you want to avoid foreclosure. Something I would ask yourself before you try to avoid foreclosure is, does it matter? Is losing that property really the worst thing in the world? Obviously, it was sentimental for me to sell my parents' stuff, to get rid of their places. It is definitely something that can be emotionally taxing. But is getting rid of that property actually the worst thing? Is losing it bad? It's not your personal credit that will be affected. So because the deceased person is dead, like again, unless it's joint property that you own together, it's not anything that's going to affect your personal finances or your personal credit. So it might be a good time to consider an exercise in letting go and letting things move on. It may not actually be the worst thing in the world to have that property repossessed or foreclosed upon. Finally, like I said, all of this can be expensive. What if you still need money? What if, there's just not enough money in the estate? You're having to pay a lot of fees. You don't have a lot, you've got a lot of stuff going on in your own life. Sometimes it can be just as expensive to make and manage money as death. Death is expensive. Sometimes making and managing money can be equally, if not more expensive. So how can you get some money to help deal with all of this stuff? One obvious option is crowdfunding. Obviously, the most popular site is GoFundMe. There are some sites that are actually funeral fundraising specific, but those are for funerals, not for everything that comes after the funeral, right? So typically in this case, you see memorial fundraisers on GoFundMe trying to get people to help cover the costs of a death. This is something you can do. It's free to set up a page. I would encourage you to not just do the bare minimum and set up the page. If you want your crowdfunding campaign to succeed, it's a good idea to think of it like something you really are putting effort into. So don't just state facts. Don't just say this person died, we're looking for money to help pay off the cost of probate or whatever. No, tell a story, tell a little bit about that person, put parts of their obituary up there, explain what it means to the family to help cover these costs. Tell a little story about it. Don't just put the bare minimum up there. Include pictures. People love to see pictures of the deceased person. That can help make your campaign more successful. It is a lot of work managing a crowdfunding campaign. You have to set up the page, you have to write all that stuff down, you have to edit it, you have to put up the pictures, you have to deal with, responding to comments when they come in, you have to thank them. Usually you do updates to the page. That is a lot of work. So this is one of those points where you should delegate to a friend or a loved one if they can do it. This is a great opportunity when all of those people in the wake of a death say, if there's anything we can do to help, this is what they can do to help. And you can pawn it off on one of them, get one of your friends to help do this task. It is something that they can tangibly do to help you. And it's going to take a lot of work off of your shoulders. It is important to know that only 17% of crowdfunding campaigns intended to cover healthcare or emergency costs meet their goals. So I think it's a great idea to set up a crowdfunding campaign to help defray costs. Do keep in mind that you may not raise as much money as you think you will. Don't assume that it will be successful and cover everything. Don't put all your eggs in that basket. On the other hand, It is also worth noting that if you raise, like, for whatever reason, if you are super popular and you raise tons and tons and tons of money, there may be some tax implications. So keep that in mind as well. What about when you get that money and you have to figure out how to spend it wisely? This is something that was a little bit intimidating to me after, my parents died and I suddenly had to manage their money and they had various assets and I just wasn't sure what to do. You can look for financial advising services. Local libraries or community colleges may offer those services, so look around in your town, in your area to see if they can help you out. Also, there is an organization called FEC Public, which is sort of like a network of various cities around the country that have come together to try to offer low or no cost financial counseling services to their citizens so that they can, manage their money well and avoid debt, all of that stuff. So that is a resource as well. If you go to fecpublic.org, they have a map where you can look up FEC Public services in your area. And I did take a look at that map, and the New Jersey FEC Public partner is located in Paterson. So that is where you will find your FEC Public partner here in New Jersey. But again, you can look at that map if you're located elsewhere, or it's worth, just going to the site to look over what they can do for you. So if you need some help with financial counseling, that is another place you can turn to if the estate or you personally can't afford to hire a financial counselor. Also worth noting, sometimes you can get it through your bank. If you are a member of a national bank, they sometimes offer financial advising services free of charge as well if you're a member of that bank. So, in conclusion, to conclude today, death is arguably more expensive than it should be. If you find yourself in a position where you are struggling to afford some of this stuff, you shouldn't be ashamed, and you're also not alone. It happens to a lot of people. Our political and business leaders should be ashamed that they've allowed this basic and often legally required aspect of life to become so expensive for so many. This is not on you, this is on them. And I think ideally we would have systemic changes in order to ease this burden, both financial and emotional, on people. But until we make those systemic changes, I hope that these tips and pointers help you out in the event that you're struggling to pay for things after a death. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening to me. My book, again, is called My Parents Are Dead, What Now? A Panic-Free Guide to the Practicalities of Death. Most of the stuff I talked about in this presentation is based on the second to last chapter of that book. So be sure to check it out. My website is deadparentswhatnow.com. I write a free weekly newsletter called The Columbarium, where I talk about the history of death and dying, because I actually majored in history as an undergrad. So I talk about the history of death and dying, plus practical advice about the same, plus jokes, because that's kind of my jam. And it's just a great way to keep up with what I'm doing generally. So please check that out and sign up for the newsletter. You can sign up on the website. Something about the book that's a good news too is if you prefer to listen to your books rather than read them, I do have an audiobook version of the book coming out in late May. You can pre-order it now wherever audiobooks are sold. And then I am on a lot of social media at Dead Parents What Now, primarily on Instagram, but you can also find me on TikTok, and I'm sort of on Facebook, but nobody else seems to be there. I might delete it. I don't know, but definitely find me on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, other places. Yeah, thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. And then I can look in the chat to see if you had questions. I do not see questions right now, but please feel free to put them in the chat or you can take yourself off mute and ask a question. I don't think there are too many of us here, so that shouldn't get too crazy. Yeah, please let me know.
That was a great presentation, Becky. Actually, I'm thinking of a couple places where we would love to invite you to speak. And I think I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm primary caretaker of both my parents. I'm a trustee on the trust taking care of my mom, and um, I know that I've been answering a lot of questions for a lot of my friends of same generation. And it's like, oh yeah, you need to get your paperwork in order. This is like gift to your family, getting things sorted out. But then it's also understanding like, well, what actually happens like next, and then next,
Yes.
and then next, and once you start taking a deep dive, you're just going, oh wow, this is a lot. Okay,
Yeah, this
so
is a
many
full-time
people are
job.
not prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to do feel free to reach out. I'd love to speak other places. And yeah, it's funny how quickly you become an expert in the wake of a death and suddenly you're answering everybody else's questions. You get, it's like a special treat when someone dies. You also get an extra job.
Oh, yay.
Yeah. Linda, do you encourage people to draw up a will and how do you do that effectively? Yes, absolutely. You should draw up a will. It is something you can do easier, I think, than most people realize. So the reason like I said, if there is no will, you would be subject to your state's intestacy laws, and that can be okay. But the problem is the state has kind of an archaic way of deciding who gets what, I would say. So it's usually based on like blood relation, and then it kind of goes from so like spouse and children would be first, and then it moves outward in the family tree from there. Depending on the state, stepchildren are not always included. So you may have a stepchild, and unless you write them into your will, they are not included. Also, of course, if you have like a longtime partner to whom you are not married, then leaving no will would be a problem because they would not be entitled to anything, depending on your state's laws. It's also just like if you're really looking to, get revenge and not leave anything to your evil brother, then if you die without a will, the state might give your evil brother stuff anyway. You don't want that to happen. So it is a good idea to draw up a will. You can go to a lawyer to do that. That's the most obvious way. But if you are concerned about lawyers' fees, there are lots of websites where they will help you draw up a boilerplate will for low or no fee. Freewill.com will do it for free. That's because they're supported by a lot of nonprofits where they want you to leave them money, but you don't have to. So, they'll help you make a will for free. That's how I made my will. There's also Trust and Will, for example, which is a really trusted site. And there are other ones out there where you can go online. You just basically answer a bunch of questions. It was really easy, quite frankly. And then if you do use a website to do it, you just have to make sure that afterwards you print it out and get it witnessed and notarized. So don't sign anything on that will until you're in front of a notary with some witnesses who can witness it and notarize it for you. And then that will make it, all right to go. And then I would make sure that your executor knows where the original is and that they have a copy of it. Yes, so please do make a will before you go. It is a good thing for you, no matter your age. It's a good idea to have a will. Justin asks, what are the biggest after-death scams you've seen or heard of that people should watch out for? I don't know if there's a specific scam that I would mention. I think a lot of you all know just it's I think about knowing your rights and knowing what you're entitled to and what you aren't subject to. So that's why I wanted to share the information about that you don't inherit debt. Like that's not something you have to take on because I think a lot of creditors don't want you to know that, and they want you to think that you have to pay off that debt yourself. And you simply do not have to pay off that debt yourself, no matter what they say, unless, again, there's co-signing or you were married and you had joint property or accounts or whatever. So I don't know if there's like a specific scam that I would mention, but I think it's just important to make sure you know what you're legally required to pay and what you're not legally required to pay. I'm trying to think if there's any other scammy things because you guys know all about the funeral stuff, so I don't need to tell you about the FTC funeral bill of rights. You have rights in terms of what you have to pay for at a funeral, all of that stuff. You don't have to pay for services you don't want to pay for. But yeah, I think of any specific scams that come to mind. I will get back to you if I do think of one. Let's see. Lisa recommends the knock box. I also have a knock box for organizing my stuff. It's pretty cool. Yeah, I really like it. It's very easy to figure out and it has these folders in it. And then it's like, I put like my passport and stuff in there too, so I don't lose it. It's a great way to put like all the important paperwork that you don't want to lose. Big fan of the knock box, but there are a lot of products out there that can help you get organized like that, whether they're binders or, if you're really into crafts and you want to make your own, but the knock box is a good one. Teresa says, my mom is co-signed on a property with her sisters. If she should pass before the property sells, will her estate receive her portion of the sale, or does she get taken off the deed upon death? I would talk to this is one of those specific situations where I'm just not quite sure. I would definitely recommend talking to an attorney in your state. That would probably be who would be best to tell you about how that works, or maybe a title company in your state, if not an attorney. Let me think. If she's co-signed on the property with her sisters, will her estate her receive? Yeah, it's really hard for me to tell without the like looking at the specific documents and knowing the specific laws in your area. I wish I could be more specific. If she should pass before the property sells. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would definitely talk to a lawyer. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific in that case. What happens if a will is done by a bank that was bought out? How long are they required to keep the will? So this is interesting. The will was created by the bank or is being stored at a bank. Uh, I don't know that I would keep the original copy of my will at a bank. I would either keep the original copy myself, or perhaps I would have my lawyer have it. Because the problem is, right, after you die, your next of kin can't really do anything financial or legally until they get those death certificates. So they can't even get to the bank to know what you want. Like, let's say you have the will in a safe deposit box. They can't even get to that safe deposit box until they have the death certificates. So yeah. Uh, I don't know, like, I don't know if there's a specific law about how long they're required to keep the will, but I would just maybe make sure you're keeping the original copy of that will someplace safe at home, like in a knockbox or other organizer. You can even get fireproof versions of those so that if something happens to your home, the will would still be safe. Or to maybe talk to the lawyer who drew, because the bank itself couldn't draw up the will. A lawyer would have had to draw up the will. Um, but if it's sitting at a bank, I would maybe I would maybe get that will at home. That would be my tip. Um, Lisa asks or says it's good to freeze credit reports. Yeah, people try to steal people's identities after they die. They go through the obituaries and see information in there. And sometimes, there's a lot of like internet security questions that are answered in obituaries, like the street you grew up on or your parents' maiden name or all of that stuff. So consider that when you're writing an obituary. It's a good idea to make sure you're not including that information in there. Just think about what those internet security questions you always get asked are and don't answer them in the obituary. But yeah, freezing credit. I didn't freeze my parents' credit, but you can. You can freeze a credit report after you die, or that way, nobody can, access that. Let's see, what else about freezing credit would be good to know. Yeah. Yeah, it's an option that you have for sure and can make sure. Also, just keep an eye on their bills, right? If you're the executor, you're, helping out, keeping track of their bills. If you notice that somebody has charged like a tropical vacation on your dead parent's credit card or your dead friend's credit card like 2 months after they died, hey, that's probably wrong and you want to report it, right? So keep an eye on those bills. Um, for estates where $0/property remains to distribute, are you saying that the executor still has to take the will to probate court? If there is a will, yeah, they still have to go through probate court. But if there's that little money, I would recommend doing either summary probate or a small estate affidavit. If it's below your state's limit, which in New Jersey is $20,000, I would definitely recommend filing for summary probate or a small estate affidavit because that will either minimize that process and shorten it, or it will get rid of that process altogether. If there's so little that you can do a small estate affidavit, usually you can they'll approve it and then you can just handle all the stuff yourself. Whatever little is left in there, you can handle it without court supervision. But yeah, like basically probate court is always involved unless stuff is set up before death to make them not involved. How does the credit card bills work if the house will not be sold? The credit card bills? Well, so if the house is being inherited by someone in the estate, like if the house is being left to a child, for example, then the estate would have to pay the mortgage bills until that child or whoever the house is left to takes over ownership. So until they officially like have the deed in their name, then they would take over ownership of those bills. But I believe the estate would pay them in the meantime. So yeah, it's like I guess I'm not sure in terms of credit card bills work. But yeah, it's like the estate would handle that until the person who's inheriting, the individual person who's inheriting takes over. And the deed is transferred to their name, then they would take over those payments.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you
It
for
was
having
really
me.
great. Very enthusiastic presentation, highly energized, filled with incredible information. I have purchased the book. I recommend it to anybody that and it is in a whole lot of different places than beside Uncle whatever his name is, Jeff's place. And the board, any final words from anyone? We're all set? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Becky, it was great. Justin, thank you for all the technical, making it look so great. And enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Thanks, Becky.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.